This is about anti-Palestinian racism, which I'm sure most of us are familiar at least with the term, but just introducing the idea that anti-Palestinian racism is a form of racism that silences, excludes, erases stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. And one of the things I like to point out with this definition is that it overlaps with, but also is distinct from anti-Muslim racism and Orientalism. And one of the things I want to kind of introduce with this slide is we talk a lot about Islamophobia and how Islamophobia works in American culture, but I really like Shireen Razak's idea of using anti-Muslim racism rather than Islamophobia as a term to kind of identify these sorts of racializing processes that are going on in anti-Muslim bias. And the reason for that is because what's often referred to as Islamophobia operates according to the same logics of racialization that are used to exclude and perpetrate violence against other racialized groups. Islamophobia suggests that fear or misunderstanding is the root cause, rather than racism or implicit bias. This distinction is important because it connects to our later discussion of the weapons of the institution. So, what's the difference between understanding the root cause of a problem as fear rather than racism? When a person or an object generates fear, it kind of opens this door to a discussion about whether or not that fear may or may not be justified or reasonable and under what circumstances. Over the last 18 months, we've all witnessed the political debates that really seem absurd to us who are like also aware of what's going on in Gaza. As Palestinians in Gaza are being bombed and killed at a rate that the world hasn't seen since Rwanda, the US Congress is debating about students on campuses and suggesting that students across the country who are calling for an end to the genocide and the occupation of Palestine are somehow creating an environment that makes others feel unsafe. So these debates that they're having are largely centered around symbols like the keffiyeh, words like intifada, and yet they take place without any real genuine reflection on what these terms or symbols mean and who gets to decide. As a medical student, I'm in my third year, I've cared for patients who are openly white supremacists, patients with swastika tattoos, one had a Hitler tattoo. And I think about like if a patient like this felt quote unquote unsafe being cared for by a medical student or an intern or a resident or any provider who was wearing a rainbow pin on their badge, who was wearing a Star of David, would a complaint from a patient about a rainbow badge or a Star of David, would it be treated as a sign that the provider had failed to be sensitive to the feelings of all the patients who might come into the hospital? Or would it immediately be recognized and appropriately treated as a sign of the patient's own biases? To engage in a discussion about what the symbols in question mean, whether it's a rainbow badge or a Star of David, would be in a way to legitimize a complaint that is biased and to legitimize it in a way that it fundamentally doesn't deserve, right? And my sense, and I'm very open to discussing it kind of in this small group session, which I think is one of the reasons we decided to found Senate, right? To be able to talk about these things. But my sense, and I'm open to discussing it and being ultimately proven wrong, is that the the correct way for us to respond to anti-Palestinian racism, as we see it take place at every level of healthcare and government institutions across the US, is that we need to treat anti-Palestinian racism when it's used to repress and discipline healthcare workers in the same way. Like we don't legitimize it by engaging in these questions about meaning or debates about feelings and who gets to decide these things, right? So that is that we should generally avoid engaging in debates that are centered on what is the meaning of the keffiyeh or the flag, because these debates ultimately at their core work to reinforce perceptions that are rooted in racism by treating these complaints as potentially legitimate. Our responses need to reject these framings and reframe a problem that is described in the language of fear or in the language of people feeling unsafe by recognizing its roots and naming them correctly as a form of racism. So a lot of the ideas I'm kind of building this section of the lecture off of is based on Shireen Razak's work. She has a book that just came out 2 years ago called Nothing Has to Make Sense, Upholding White Supremacy Through Anti-Muslim Racism. She's also the argument about why to use that term as opposed to Islamophobia earlier. That's Shireen Razak's argument. And so one of the things that she says is that The racializing logics of white supremacy are appearing most evident in moments when nothing has to make sense, right? Like when you feel like something totally absurd is happening. There's no logic, there's no reason. It's like the laws of how things are supposed to operate just become suspended. And she talks about this moment where racial and imperial fantasies take root and the dream figures in our heads take over, inviting us to feel rather than to think, crowding out rationality, establishing subjects who believe in their own superiority and are prepared to make it true on the ground. And so another person that I've really drawn on their work, a scholar, a feminist scholar, Sarah Ahmed, she has this book. She has everything she's written is pretty amazing, but the cultural politics of emotion. She talks about she has this concept that she calls sticking, how things or concepts come to be associated with each other. If you want to be academic about it, she calls it a metonymic slide, but you can also just think of it as sticking if academics aren't your thing. And so she argues that this kind of sticking functions as an implicit argument about the causal relations between terms, such as Islam and terrorism, and it works in such a way that it does not require an explicit statement. And even statements that are made directly negating the relationship between those terms or challenging that relationship, it can work to stick them together even more closely, right? So she says that it can stick words like terrorist and Islam together, even when arguments are made that seem to unmake those links. And we can see this kind of sticking taking place even in press coverage of things like encampments, when people get on TV and they say, our encampment was not anti-Semitic. You see the idea of like an encampment and this idea of anti-Semitism, even in a statement that's trying to kind of counter that narrative, they come closer together just because of their proximity, like linguistically. And as people, it reinforces those neural pathways where you start to understand that like these are two things that go together. So 10 days prior to the congressional anti-Semitism hearings that took place on December 5th, 2023, three Palestinian college students speaking Arabic and wearing keffiyehs were shot in Vermont. The incident was almost entirely ignored during these anti-Semitism hearings, except by a well-meaning congressman who attempted to draw attention to a glaring example of violence prompted by anti-Palestinian racism. And yet, even in his statement, a statement that tries to adamantly reassure the listeners that these were college students who were walking home to a relative's house after spending a night at the bowling alley. It has this effect of sticking certain things together. So the question that I want to bring up, like with this example, is how can we kind of start to pull them apart methodically to understand step by step what's actually taking place here? How can we kind of disentangle these racializing logics that are at work through his statement? Like when he says they were walking back from going bowling, all three students were absolutely, they were going to their relative's house at the time. It's this kind of like when they say, if he's responding to a kind of an implicit question that never has to be asked, but is always present. And it's the same question that we see when people ask, a rape survivor or a sexual assault survivor, what was she wearing? It's kind of this move to justify or this move to like, she wasn't even wearing a short skirt. She was wearing like jeans and a coat, or she wasn't X or Y or Z. It's like a response to a question that hasn't been asked, but it's always asked, right? In the mainstream discourse. So we see this kind of emphatic, adamant statement that they were really absolutely just going back home after bowling like any other group of college students. This emphatic statement is an attempt to unstick signs that remain unmentioned, but it effectively works to fortify the links that it implicitly conjures in the same moment when he's speaking, right? Like this group of students who are speaking Arabic, wearing keffiyehs, and are Palestinian, these three kind of things or these three objects remain stuck to the possibility that those who survived a blatant hate crime might have somehow been an appropriate or a justified target for violence. A well-intentioned congressman makes some sort of feeble attempt to address the violence of anti-Palestinian racism, and yet somehow in doing so, his statement further entrenches the cognitive links that serve as the foundation for the racializing logic through which such violence is not only made possible, but comes to appear as ordinary and unremarkable, such that it falls almost entirely outside of that which is considered an urgent enough problem to demand the attention of the US Congress. So I have another second example to kind of link things together. This sign and this quote are from the memorial service that took place for Wadi al-Fayoumi, the 6-year-old Palestinian child who was killed in his Chicago home when the landlord attacked him and his mother on October 14th, 2023. We see how like these statements and the sign, they try to do the same sort of unsticking. I am not a threat. Or this was an all-American boy. He didn't wear a sign or a necklace stating he was Muslim. He wore a smile on his face. He was filled with love and not filled with any hate. Like they're trying to argue back against this question that is present but is never explicitly asked. And the effect of making these kind of arguments, whether it's by a well-intentioned congressman or people who are very much trying to affirm that these egregious instances of violence were wrong and morally reprehensible, right? Like to make these arguments, even when you think you're kind of pulling things apart, like doing an unsticking, countering the Islamophobic or the anti-Muslim or the anti-Palestinian narratives, they have this effect of kind of reinforcing those same racializing logics that are at the very core of anti-Palestinian racism. So if we think about what unstated questions this sign or this quote try to answer, we want to think about what sorts of associations these questions are assuming. And if we start with the sign, we see like a Palestinian flag alongside the text that I am not a threat. It answers some version of the question, are Palestinians a threat? Or perhaps are Palestinians a threat and in what circumstances? And as a group, we want to think about like when does the perception of a threat or the perception of someone as threatening justify violence against them in the eyes of the American public or the US legal system? And how does that overlap with these logics of racialization that we see operating through this process of kind of sticking things together? Oh, mom, I think this is your slide.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for setting this up, Morgan, with these really important concepts. So I'm just going to reinforce some of the things Morgan has already referenced while also talking about like what the function of sticking or creating these associations are. So does attempting to unstick these harmful associations work? And does it uplift our movement for social change? So obviously in this session, we're arguing that continuously trying to unstick the associations that are deliberately being made by our institutions. So for example, mentioning Palestine in healthcare settings makes patients feel unsafe, right? That's a common association we've been seeing happening in the last 17 months. Or that critiquing Israel is anti-Semitic. That's another common association. Or that it's unprofessional to talk about genocide in the clinic. That's another common association we've seen. These associations are deliberately built by the structures of white supremacy, many of these structures that we discussed in the last sessions, and are deliberately crafted as a form of distraction. So to focus on unsticking the associations. So, for example, arguing with someone that critiquing Israel is in fact not anti-Semitic, which is truly an obvious conclusion, or arguing with someone that talking about ending a genocide doesn't make patients feel unsafe is actually distracting us from where we should be putting our energy, which is changing the structures. We often will go round and round, and we get stuck trying to pull apart these harmful associations. And the conversation never moves beyond, for instance, resisting genocide is not anti-Semitic, to where it really should be, which is making explicit how our medical admin or schools or hospitals are profiting from or endorsing genocide, how they're profiting from or endorsing policing and incarceration, things like that. And so when we actually fall into their trap of trying to argue about the association, we reinforce the association. And Morgan already talked about that. So just to hone, just to like really hammer this concept down, I'm going to give a personal example. So I've talked before about being suspended from medical school for violations of professionalism and respect. Because apparently saying that doctors shouldn't participate in militaries committing genocide gets you suspended from medical school. But the association here is that critiquing Israel and IDF soldiers is unprofessional in medicine. And what they want is for me to fall into the trap of unsticking that association, which looks like apologizing profusely for being unprofessional or apologizing for making IDF soldiers feel unsafe for murdering or facilitating the murder of Palestinians, etc. And beyond just reinforcing these associations, and trying to get me to apologize and unstick the associations actually necessitates that I agree with the assumption that critiquing IDF soldier doctors for committing genocide was unprofessional. So, what they want from us is to say, oh, I'm so sorry for making someone feel unsafe because they supported the genocide of Palestinians. And that I'll never do that again. I didn't mean to be threatening, etc. So getting stuck and trying to unstick those associations reinforces them, and it also pushes us in a position to actually accept the validity of that association in some condition, because then I would admit that I was in fact threatening by calling into question a doctor who served in the IDF as it committed genocide. And we'll go through some examples in the small group about how this operates, because it ends up looking like a feedback loop, which is what this picture is attempting to illustrate. And I'll pass it back to Morgan.
Thank you. So we have this concept of breaking down the physics of anti-Palestinian racism and its racializing logics. And we have this idea of sticking, and then the next concept is stretching, sticking and stretching. To illustrate this next concept, I hope you guys will forgive me for using a personal example because it's not particularly special or unique, but it's something I know about intimately. And most of these conversations, when this is happening, it takes place behind closed doors and it's not aired publicly in a way that we can analyze it and kind of use it and break it down to understand how these logics are at work. So I'm just using my own example, not because it's, unique. Um, but anyway, so when I was reported for my scrub cap, the initial complaint was that it was a political symbol and therefore should not be present in the workplace. My home institution does not actually have any policy that bans political symbols in the workplace, and providers, medical students, residents, attendings regularly wear symbols like the rainbow pin or Black Lives Matter ribbons, and it's not seen as there's no rule that prohibits this, right? And these are things that could be considered political, especially under the current administration. So as the kind of disciplinary questions around this reporting of the scrub cap moved forward, the questions that became relevant were totally unrelated to this initial complaint about a political symbol in the workplace. They centered around two policies related first to the dress code for medical students, and then secondly, related to patient safety. In order to determine whether or not a scrub cap worn by a student on a surgical rotation could, in fact, be considered a dress code violation, the language of the dress code policy prompted very specific questions, such as, what floor of the hospital was the scrub cap worn on at the time the report was made? And how much of the student's hair was actually inside the scrub cap on a typical workday? That's related to this question of hygiene, right? Like the policy says something about, let me look at it, like handling sterile equipment, or it's like this idea that if the scrub cap is not worn in a way that's consistent with hygiene, it can't be considered part of the uniform, and it can then become a violation, right? Like what floor, how much hair, like it's absurd. And so I argue like that this sort of these questions, they lead us as a collective, they might lead us to ask how, like what's the process through which a scrub cap becomes a hat to render it a dress code violation? How does a hospital become an appropriate military target, exempting it from the protections of humanitarian law? How does a pediatrician become a so-called terrorist, permitting his illegal detention without evidence or justification? All of these transformations are operating and taking place according to a singular racializing logic. And this is the logic that we see operating when that boy at the memorial service for Wadia al-Fayoumi, the Palestinian child who was stabbed 26 times by his landlord, holds up a sign and says, I'm not a threat. Or when a man in Florida shoots two strangers, and when he's asked what prompted the attack, his response is that he thought they were Palestinian. This is a particular kind of stretching and like absurdity that we see in all of these evidence, and how do we kind of connect it and think through it. So another example I want to give for this, with her permission, of course, is Umaima's example. When she was suspended from medical school, and you can see all of this in the document published by like the Office of Open Expression. I forget the exact acronym, but it's like the Open Expression Office on Emory's campus. One of the initial policies they charged her with violating was the social media policy, right? And she did an interview with Democracy Now!, an internationally acclaimed media outlet. The social media policy is published by the AMA to kind of discipline things like medical students shotgunning beer on Instagram and having videos of med students go viral, like, being really drunk in public. And yet we see these policies stretched in all of these different ways, all of these different bullet points, the AMSA social media guidelines, to work to try to punish and discipline her for an interview with an internationally acclaimed media outlet. Like it's a kind of absurdity where we see these policies and their logic starts to stretch and be pulled up to fit almost anything inside that which can be governed by them, right? It's like, how do we understand this elasticity, the stretching that we see at work, and how do we understand that as a sort of fundamental basis through which logics that are racializing come to operate?
Thank you so much, Morgan, for setting up the first part of this session. So, in the next part, part two, we're going to be talking about the weapons and tactics of the institution, particularly on how they're used against healthcare workers. So we're going to introduce some content that's going to overlap between this week and next week's session. We're going to learn how to recognize these tactics and weapons that medical institutions are using to silence and discipline healthcare workers. And then next week, we're going to learn the strategies that healthcare workers can use to neutralize these particular tactics so we don't get distracted by them, like we mentioned before. And weapons of the institution are referring particularly to the tactics used by medical institutions to shut down the efforts of healthcare workers advocating and mobilizing to name, oppose, and end genocide and all other structures of violence like racism and policing and incarceration. So we've sort of identified four main weapons of the institution. So we're going to go through these in detail in the next few slides. I'll let you guys take a look at them. It's important to also keep in mind that many of these weapons and tactics are actually formulas. Medical institutions and admins are trained to use them. They are predictable. We can learn to expect them, which is why we can practice formulating a response when they use these tactics against us. So the first sort of tactic and weapon that we've named is the myth that medicine is apolitical or that it should be apolitical. There is a very dangerous precedent being set by modern medicine that with the false narrative that medicine and healthcare should be apolitical. First of all, anyone with even a slightly critical lens or has literally read anything about our system of healthcare will tell you that medicine is entirely political. Our last session concretized how medicine and healthcare has been used as a tool, in fact, to further the political goals of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, colonialism, and etc. But everything about our healthcare system and practices are determined by political decisions and determined by the systems of domination and subjugation that we live under. Who has access to medical care, how much that care costs, the quality of care you receive, which healthcare sites you can access, which provider you get, which diagnostic and treatment options you're offered, what standards of care are used. All of these are determined by employers, insurance companies, healthcare state and government policies, all political entities. And this is a very, very, very brief overview, but it is worth mentioning because of how hard medicine tries to obfuscate its connection with systems of domination, subjugation, and control. And one of the examples I put here to demonstrate this is the way that healthcare systems talk about, for instance, social determinants of health is very misleading. We all know what, most healthcare workers know what social determinants of health are, right? Like these include housing, transportation, food access, healthcare quality, etc. And in medical education, it's often taught that these social determinants of health are like some amorphous characteristics of a person's health status that just like magically exist. As if the fact that Black patients have less access to every necessary institution for life, like housing or transportation or food, is an inherent part of their identity, rather than a deliberate system meant to debilitate Black and Brown and Indigenous and migrant communities. It's really problematic to be talking about social conditions, or in this case, social determinants of health, as if they're inherent, rather than a product of systems of domination and subjugation that were deliberately crafted. It's meant, speaking about them in this way, like they do in medicine about social determinants of health, obfuscates the mechanisms in which this harm is actually happening to our communities. It obfuscates how Indigenous people have worse health outcomes than non-Indigenous peoples, and it ascribes to it a racist underpinning of inherent biological inferiority, which we still see people do today, rather than acknowledging the fact that the hospital itself, the clinic itself, is built on the mass graves of Indigenous peoples. These things become obfuscated when we subscribe social determinants of health as just things that exist. These are just the conditions as they are, rather than deliberately crafted in conditions. So we need to continuously push back on these false and dangerous ideas that are meant to hide medicine's role in the violence of debilitating marginalized communities. So the second weapon, which probably many of us have faced or confronted at some point, if you've done any advocacy at all in healthcare, is that of professionalism. We can say a lot about this. Hopefully, this is a good enough introduction for us to learn how to identify how it's used to silence us. Professionalism in medicine is really just coded language for whiteness. What is white, hetero, masculine, and white supremacist is considered professional, and any deviation from it is considered unprofessional. This tool of violence has been used to punish and discipline Black and Brown and Indigenous providers since Western medicine came to exist and interact with those communities. In the previous decades, we've seen professionalism be exposed as a way to police Black and Brown healthcare workers. So that's included everything from their hairstyles to the way that they dress to the way that they speak. We've seen Black physicians receive professionalism violations for racialized and racist perceptions of their speech as aggressive, for example, or Indigenous healthcare workers being punished for wearing their hair in traditional ways, and so much more. But professionalism is also used to censor, discipline, and punish the ways that healthcare workers engage in political expression and community engagement. So, for example, at my medical school, white men are allowed to organize entire registered medical student organizations around restricting medical access and care to abortion. But it's not allowed for medical students to organize to end the genocide in Palestine or support the healthcare workers in Gaza. Therefore, professionalism as a tool operates to protect the political ambitions of white supremacy in medicine and squash the organizing and community building necessary to counter it. That's why it's allowable for students at my school to literally organize around restricting healthcare access, and it's protected for them to organize around restricting healthcare access to the people they believe don't deserve it, while I, as a Palestinian student, get suspended for saying that doctors shouldn't participate in militaries committing genocide, and why students at my medical school are unable to organize around Palestine and around the genocide. So this coded language of professionalism gets used to justify suspensions, lack of promotions, terminations, harassments of medical students and faculty. And it's important for us to recognize this weapon of the institution when it operates because it's particularly insidious. So in my suspension, for example, they cited a professionalism violation without allowing for a conversation about the genocide, about healthcare workers and the IDF, without any actual evidence of anything I've done on my part. Professionalism is a tool that can be stretched and molded to fit whatever the medical institution wants it to fit. And it allows them to discipline and punish with no real justification other than professional violation. So there is no justification for my suspension other than the words violations of professionalism and respect, and therefore I got suspended for a year. And so this particular tool is used to obfuscate racialized violence against healthcare workers and students without even necessitating a justification for it on official records. So this is going to require some unpacking, and maybe we'll unpack it a little bit more in the next session. But medical institutions, and we've seen this weaponized sort of broadly among institutions around safety. Um, I think this actually might have been the most weaponized tool. So many healthcare workers and students have been silenced and punished for allegedly making people feel unsafe for talking about Palestine or talking about ending the genocide or talking about institutional complicity in policing and violence, etc. This tool has also been used to silence and punish Black and brown healthcare workers when they mention racism or colonialism in their workplaces because it makes people feel unsafe. And so this begs several questions for us to consider. First, healthcare systems are deliberately conflating safety with discomfort. And I say deliberately because they know what they're doing. So, yeah, of course, it's going to make our white supremacist colleagues very uncomfortable when we talk about their complicity in genocide or police violence. But that's not the same thing as being unsafe. So, what's been deliberately done is the association that white safety is predicated on maintaining white supremacy and Black and brown subjugation in the same way that safety has falsely been predicated on the eradication of Palestinians. These harmful, violent associations around safety are incredibly damaging to providers, patients, and communities. What does it mean when the safety of one group of people is predicated on the destruction or dispossession of another? And particularly, what does it mean when healthcare workers are upholding that definition of safety? What it means is that medicine is functioning as a white supremacist institution built to protect whiteness and destroy Black and brown and indigenous communities. And in fact, Western medicine does predicate its existence on our dispossession and annihilation. The second important question this begs is whose safety matters? For instance, when Zionist students claim to feel unsafe that I, a Palestinian student who openly condemns my medical school's role in genocide, the school immediately opens up an investigation, right? But when a professor of medicine who has been reported probably dozens of times, who is also my teacher, goes to serve in the IDF as it commits a genocide against my community, my claims of feeling unsafe, actually unsafe, because we have a physician who believes in the legitimacy and necessity of the genocide of Palestinians, gets to come back and teach a clerkship to Palestinian Black and brown students, that is actually an unsafe situation, but is ignored completely by the institution. And so this exposes that in medicine, only the safety of white supremacists matter. And medicine as an institution will choose to protect them over Black and brown and indigenous students or workers. And I'll make one more point on this slide, is that this red herring also falsely assumes that Black and brown liberation, freedom, and safety comes at the expense of white people. And maybe that's because whiteness has defined its safety as the subjugation of the other, but our communities don't operate in the same way. Collective liberation, Palestinian liberation, Black liberation, Indigenous liberation is freedom for all of us. We are all safer without policing. We are all safer without colonialism. We are all safer without genocide. We are all safer when we are free. And so don't let the institution change that principled position you have around safety and justice. And now I'll pass it on to Asfiya.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to finish out our didactic portion with a couple slides. And these two slides actually bring home some of the points that you've already heard earlier, talking about sticking, the concept of stretching, specifically weaponizing safety. And it'll bring it into a little more focus, and I'll give another example as well as we finish out. So gaslighting. Gaslighting is about erasing and replacing, much like settler colonialism. This particular tactic projects a distorted version of reality onto you, the healthcare worker, and denies your actual reality. The more people that participate in the gaslighting from the institution, the more overwhelming that experience is for the individual targeted. Gaslighting can happen in a way that targets an individual. It can also happen in a way that targets a group as a whole. So I think this is a good moment that we're actually going to pause and listen in to a conversation between Muhammad Al-Kurd and Abby Martin, because they bring this point home about what gaslighting is.
Okay, just give me one moment, Elspia, to pull up this video for you.
And for those who aren't already, make sure you're following both Abby Martin and Muhammad Al-Kurd.
Browbeat.
You guys see that?
Yes. Might have to hover to get the volume over.
Into condemning something that isn't happening and to sanitize your rage about a genocide that is actually happening. Black is white, up is down. Words are terrorism, but drone bombings are not.
It's an upside down world. I say somewhere in that thing, I say you feel like you're trapped in someone else's hallucination. And this is why I think it's so dangerous to get caught in these things, to get caught in these discursive traps, or to fall into these rhetorical loops that are extremely distracting, you know. This is why be you a student or an academic or somebody at a bookstore, at a hospital or whatever, and you get falsely accused of anti-Semitism while the so-called self-proclaimed Jewish state, you know, literally burns people alive in the refugee tents. I don't think it's wise to engage in any of these kinds of discursive traps because they are fundamentally red herrings. They're meant to take away from the focal point, which is genocide. Now, I'm not saying that maybe there are some students whose fear is legitimate, that it's bodily and visceral and real, but it's also not my problem. We literally have tens of thousands of people under the rubble that we have to worry about burying. We have no time for such ridiculous conversations, assuaging the paranoias of our oppressors.
I think the volume cut out at the end, but what he says at the end is we need to set the terms for our own engagement and not start with the gaslighting premise that is given to us and put upon us, and taking control of that moment. So again, next week, you're going to learn some strategies for how to actually do that. Now, as I read the next few examples of gaslighting statements, I want you to think about where your mind goes when you hear this, how your body feels viscerally when you hear this. And these may be phrases that you've heard yourself already. So pay attention to that. So imagine you're pulled into the office of your director and in an administrative meeting, and you're told, you've really put us in a bad situation. Your actions were unprofessional. Your speech was anti-Semitic, and we're getting many complaints. And imagine that you're being told, you know, we just don't engage politics here. We just want to do medicine, right? So think about how your body feels, how you react emotionally. Do you get into an alarm system? Do you start panicking? You know, how many of you have been in this situation where you've been accused in this kind of a way, right? And you're put on the defense. Maybe your mind goes blank. Maybe you start searching for some sort of defensive argument to quickly justify and protect yourself, right? Maybe you start trying to figure out a way to prove your intention, that you didn't mean to be unprofessional, right? Maybe you start defending yourself. I didn't mean to offend anyone. I didn't mean to cause a problem, right? And this kind of a tactic works really well on conscientious, empathic, caring, compassionate healthcare workers, right? At some point, hopefully, and you may have come to this, you start wondering, now, how on earth did I become the problem? And this is the point. The point of gaslighting is to disorient you, right? It's to convince you that you've done something wrong so that you waste your time trying to defend yourself and that you lose your momentum for what your action actually was, your advocacy. Or perhaps you freeze and you panic and you stop advocating altogether, right? The fear response. Now, in this last slide, we're going to talk about weaponizing DEI. And this is part of gaslighting. It's a very specific example of it. And I think, we can all appreciate that, DEI across medical institutions really is a performative space that doesn't call for accountability, certainly doesn't address white supremacy. In fact, quite the opposite, right? So here's an example of weaponizing DEI. So I'm a board certified child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I'm also the clinical consultant to DEI at Prairie Care Newport, the largest provider of mental health services for children in the US, perhaps with the exception of the carceral system. So I gave a talk last summer on genocide and trauma-informed care. And I did this as part of BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month. In it, I talked about the legacies of settler colonialism, reservations, boarding schools, chattel slavery, and Nakba. I taught about the various layers of erasure, exile, and different types of othering. And I offered specific trauma-informed approaches that clinicians can use to care for BIPOC patients. Now, despite 100 feedback surveys that same day from local mental health workers, colleagues in the community that serve the same patients that I was talking about, expressing overwhelming appreciation for the content, hoping for a copy of the talk and the recording of it so they could share it with their colleagues, so they could start using it. The talk was immediately removed from access, and within 24 hours it was banned. To this day, it's banned. And I'm currently censored from teaching in my institutional capacity. So here's the point. The talk was not even seen by the executives before the decision was made to ban it. The feedback of 100 colleagues in mental health who attended the talk wasn't even reviewed or necessary before making the decision. It didn't matter, right? This is the absurdity. It didn't matter. There's no logic. So in the tactic of weaponizing DEI, inclusivity is weaponized very specifically. And this is how many DEI initiatives are shut down. When racist complaints are made, these complaints are lifted up and given legitimacy without any critical examination necessary. And BIPOC narratives and voices are devalued and eliminated in the name of inclusion, right? So we get to this inclusion through exclusion, right? Safety through erasure. Inclusion for who? Whose safety? So if you're ever wondering in general how to understand a particular tactic or wonder like how to orient yourself, think about the outcome of that tactic. That's where you're going to figure out the function of it. So in this case, for example, the outcome was the elimination of Palestinian narrative and the elimination of clinical training on trauma-informed care for BIPOC communities. This was never about inclusion. It was about maintaining the status quo of white supremacy and providing diplomatic cover for genocide. So as we shift now into the breakout sessions, what we're going to do is look at a couple of vignettes, and we're going to practice identifying weapons of the institution that are at play in each scenario. And we're going to think together in our small groups How is that particular weapon, that particular tactic functioning in order to specifically shut down healthcare workers, bring down your advocacy, repress you, instill fear, instill some sense of hopelessness, lack of agency? How is that particular, or the multiple weapons that you might recognize, weapons of the institution, how are they being used to repress healthcare workers?